Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. Border Patrol agents recently rescued a group of migrants whose inflatable rafts tipped them into the rain-swollen Rio Grande, with one agent jumping into the river to save a 7-year-old boy who had separated from his float and was going under in the swift current. I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Sylvia Foster-Frau to learn more about this dramatic rescue. So, Sylvia, great to have you again here on the podcast. You're one of our normal guests. Let's get right to it. As I mentioned, the word dramatic, this was a very dramatic rescue. Now on expressnews.com, there are photos and also videos of the aftermath of all this. So let's start with the basics. When did this take place, and how was someone from Express News there to witness it?
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Chance. So I had gone down to the Del Rio sector of Border Patrol, and specifically Eagle Pass, which is a small border town, and I was getting a ride along with Border Patrol, which they sometimes do for media. They kind of basically let you into one of their vehicles and drive you around and kind of show you how it's done at the border when it comes to apprehending migrants that are coming across. And then they kind of they were going to show us that and then give us a tour also of the Eagle Pass Border Patrol station and just kind of talk to us along the way. We could ask any questions that we wanted. So they had called me earlier that week asking if I wanted to do that after some kind of previous stories that I had been reporting out of that area. And so I took them up on their offer, and me and our photographer, Bob Owen, went down there, and we had been driving around for a couple hours, I want to say, at that point, when we had been hoping to see a family or a migrant crossing the river. That's a very common area where migrants cross the river. And we had driven by that portion of the area and hadn't seen anything at that point. And so we kind of kept on going. We went back into town, and then that's when Border Patrol officer Brian Kemet, who was driving, that's when he heard on the radio that there was a migrant crossing. And so he asked us if we wanted to take a look, and we said yes. But we still at this point didn't know that it was going to be a rescue situation. We didn't know it was going to be such a harrowing experience for us to watch and for those who were involved to participate in. We just thought we were going to see a group of migrants crossing the river, which is done, dozens of times in that sector, and hundreds and thousands of times migrants are crossing the border every day, every week, every month. So we kind of thought it was going to be a routine crossing until we got there.
Sylvia, we're going to get right back to this train of thought, but a few things that you mentioned I want to jump on now before we move on too far. You mentioned that you were contacted about this ride-along, and immediately when you mentioned that you were traveling with a border agent, I wondered what that would have been like, because not necessarily yourself, but as reporters continue to cover these border crossings and everything related to the border, I'm sure some of those stories might rub the Border Patrol or some of the agents the wrong way. So when you say they reached out to you and then you were traveling with them, what is that like? And do you think they reached out to you specifically, perhaps because they thought maybe they weren't looking so good in the press?
Yeah, when I asked them why they reached out to me, Brady Wakel, who's the spokesman for that sector, said that he had been getting a lot of the questions I had, so I had been emailing them a lot of questions, trying to get answers about their migrant releases. So kind of at the other end of the asylum seeker process, the people that were getting released on the streets in Eagle Pass, I wanted to know, why they chose that location for release, what bus options were available there, and was really digging into kind of that side of the story. And I was getting the same statement back with every time for like three or a few stories that I did in that area, or just not getting a response at all, which was frustrating to me. But I think they also realized that it started to look bad on them that they weren't responding. I would have to have lines in my stories that say, they didn't answer the specific question, or all they said was this, and so I think they started to realize that it was starting to look bad from them to just have these kind of blanket rote statements, and kind of half baked, or not fully answering the questions that I had. So then at some point, they reached out to me. So I guess they had made a decision that it would actually be more to their benefit to just open the doors and kind of give me a person to person explanation about what's going on, and what their perspective is about things going on down there. So I really think they just wanted their voice to be heard, and their perspective to be out there, and they weren't doing that before. And I, of course, I'm eager to hear their perspective, and I'm curious about what their job is like, right there on the border that's talked about so much, and yet their every day is what's being talked about. So I was also eager to hear their perspective as well. And I don't think they were expecting a rescue situation either. I mean, when do you expect that to happen? But I also can say they probably weren't surprised that one happened while we were there either, because that's become more and more frequent.
Shifting back to what you just mentioned, the rescue situation, that's my second question based on what you just told me earlier. I believe you phrased it that they asked if you wanted to take a look, and you agreed, and then the rescue took place, but by no means did you or anyone with you at the time think that was going to be the case. I don't want to jump to any conclusions, but does that mean that this rescue might not have happened had your group not gone in that direction?
No, so they have Border Patrol agents that are posted at different points in the river, and especially because they know that's a high traffic area, they have a lot of agents around there that are constantly checking that area. So they were already agents on the scene when we arrived. And actually, the man that jumped into the river, though he was with us, though he had been in the ride along with us, there were other people there. And that were on the scene. He just happened to be there with us and happened to see the kid. And so as a Border Patrol agent, it was very natural for him, at least, from what he told me, to kind of take action and basically join the team, kind of jump right into the scene and eventually ends up rescuing that kid. But to be clear, there was a team already there, participating and assessing the situation and then intervening when the Migrant's floats capsized.
Okay, so then I'm glad I asked that question. It sounds like whether or not you and the officers with you had been there that day, there were other people present. And that leads me into another question. This rescue took place just days after a raft capsized at night. It tossed another group of migrants into the same stretch of the river. That time, a 10-year-old boy drowned, and 3 others are missing from that capsizing. You've mentioned this earlier, but I guess I want to get more detail on it. Just how often are these river crossings happening? I mean, is it just every day? If you stand at one point in the river, you'll just see multiple flotillas going by?
Yeah, at this point, I would say it's probably every day at that strip of the river. It's just become really, really common. And, advocates will say it's because of some of the policies that have been put in place at the legal ports of entry. We've now started kind of metering and minimizing the number of asylum seekers that can be processed and go through those ports of entry, which are also, it's kind of like a jargony term for basically these. In this area, there are these bridges right over the water, and you can walk up to the bridge and basically say that you request asylum. But the Trump administration has really lowered the number of asylum seekers it allows at those ports of entry. And so what ends up happening is a really long wait list, basically, of people trying to get in. And when you have desperate migrants that have been traveling weeks or months to get to the United States to ask for asylum, and then they're forced to wait weeks or months on the Mexico side of the border, a lot of them, what they end up doing is just going across the river, getting apprehended, and then saying they seek asylum. And then they're kind of put in that same process as if they had gone through the port of entry, which is the asylum process. So more people are coming between the ports of entry. And then on top of that, you have a few other factors. So the water is really high right now in that area, which makes it more dangerous. So, moving from talking about crossings to talking about, the need for rescues and it being dangerous, like the river is really high. You have more people or a lot of people coming across it. And then on top of that, the recent kind of demographic for migrants that are coming to the United States are often families, asylum seekers with very young children. And so the chances of them being put at risk by crossing the river or needing a Border Patrol intervention, saving basically on the river, is a lot higher when you have a more vulnerable population. So I think all of those things are kind of coming together at once, basically, and leading to really high numbers of Border Patrol rescues, predominantly on the river. And that's something, so you didn't ask for stats, but I'll just give you one stat, that in the Del Rio sector, the agents have performed 370 rescues so far this fiscal year. It's been about 7 months into the fiscal year. And compared to that same amount of time last year, it was only 31. So we're talking like over 1,000% increase in rescues of migrants trying to cross and needing to be rescued by Border Patrol agents. And nearly all of them are on the river.
So, Sylvia, as I've mentioned, there are photos and also a video online at expressnews.com accompanying your two stories along this topic. I was surprised when I first checked them out because I expected maybe some sort of raft or something that could be kind of considered to be a raft. But from what I can tell, these look like small pools that a child might play in someone's backyard. In fact, something I probably played in when I was young. Is that correct? Am I mislabeling what I'm seeing?
No, that's exactly what they are. They're inflatable pools. So they're not even necessarily meant to be on the water, much less on these high kind of fast moving waters. I'm assuming they must just be cheap and easy to purchase on that side of the border. But yeah, so like the group that we saw, there were 3 of these inflated pools, and there were 2 smaller ones and then 1 slightly larger one. And that's what they were using to kind of float across. And then they kind of used their hands to paddle or hope that the river's current would kind of take them to the other side.
And now wrapping things up for our conversation, Sylvia, I want to give you time for final thoughts at the end, but I have a question about everything that we've talked about so far, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong here. I know Border Patrol agents, they use megaphones to tell migrants not to cross the river. They say it's too dangerous and that they should try going through a legal port of entry. Now, you've already talked about how that might not be an option, at least a very quick option, based on what's happening right now at the border. However, the Border Patrol says that it generally doesn't intervene to pick up migrants in the river unless someone is in distress or at high risk. So as you've also mentioned, people crossing the river, that seems to be a daily occurrence at this point, but not everyone who's crossing needs to be assisted. I'm wondering, does that mean that if Border Patrol agents see people floating by, unless they're in need of rescue, do they literally do nothing? Do they just make sure that they don't need a rescue, and then if they don't, they just float on by?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Chance. And I found this really interesting talking to them about this. So basically, the Border Patrol agents are treading a very fine line here. So between rescuing them versus letting them cross, they basically want to make sure that no one is put in danger. They do have a humanitarian kind of mission to make sure that no one dies or is injured, in front of their very eyes on the river. But at the same time, they don't want to create what they call a pull factor, which is basically, the second anyone puts their toes in the water or steps into that water, that they know that they'll get picked up by Border Patrol and taken to land. So they don't necessarily want to make it easier for people to come across, but they also don't want people, to get seriously injured or die coming across, because that river is the border itself. And so it's kind of it's a limbo. So if you're coming from the U.S. side and you are fishing in the river, you technically still haven't left the U.S. This is how they explained it to me. And if you're coming from Mexico and you go fishing in the river, or you cross the river, you still technically haven't left Mexico. So it's kind of in this no man's land where basically they don't want to create a pull factor that by just constantly picking up migrants the second they get in the water, but they also do have a mission and they do have this kind of humanitarian component where they're not going to let someone, as in the case of this 7-year-old kid, they're not going to let him drown or let other migrants get injured or worse on the river. So they're constantly trying to decide at what point does that migrant in the river that they're all watching, right? Because the border security there and along the border, like there's cameras, there's agents, there's these jet boats that you can see in some of the photos of our article. So they're all watching, they see them there, but the question is, at what point are they endangered enough or in distress enough, or is there a high enough risk where they're going to come and intervene and pick them up and just take them to the U.S. side and then begin their asylum process?
As I mentioned, Sylvia, I want to give you some time for final thoughts before we say goodbye. You're the immigration reporter for the San Antonio Express News. You've been to the border countless times. You not only know about the phenomenon we're talking about now, but you have seen it. You've experienced it. You were there at this moment when the rescue took place. You've written about it now multiple times. All that's available at expressnews.com. What does this piece of the immigration puzzle mean to you compared to everything else that we've already talked about here in your multiple appearances on the podcast? Is there any way to, I'm hard pressed to say improve, but is there any way to make this better so maybe less people are crossing, or that they can get more help compared to what's already happening right now? It sounds like the way that you've described it, especially the way border agents kind of are stuck in no man's land about whether or not they intervene or not, it kind of seems like maybe this is just a side effect of what's going on. And I don't know if there's any way to really fix this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors at play that have led to this dynamic that's shown in one very kind of real specific moment, right, with this rescue. But everything that led up to that rescue could be related to the Trump administration's policies, to the conditions in Central America, to the Border Patrol itself, the border communities and how they behave and how they view, the immigration questions and controversy in this country. So I think all of those kinds of lenses could be applied to this one situation. And I guess I just really took away, that moment to me just made everything a little less black and white. I received reader feedback from both sides of the political spectrum, either upset or pleased with the article, because some people don't want to see Border Patrol as having a humanitarian aspect. Some people wish that these migrants didn't need saving in the first place because they had a less dangerous means of getting to the country. There's a lot of kind of misconceptions out there, and a lot of people on both sides that I think see things in very black and white. And to me, this moment of the agents kind of saving the migrants, but at the same time, right after they save them, they're taking them to the Border Patrol station and then possibly detention for processing. So just seeing all those dynamics play out in such a human way, person to person, they're talking together, they're, asking them questions, and seeing that in person, I guess, was just really striking and reminded me that things are a lot more nuanced and complicated than you would think.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Sylvia Foster Frau for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.